It's so good to have you, man. I'm so excited about this. Like, mostly just so we can laugh about crazy times and crazy stories.
Oh, the stories are there.
Because the thing is, for me, you embody a lot of who I have become. Because I think of I think of my time we were together at Bethel, and I think of you were like, if there was an angel on my shoulder, you were the devil.
That was
I
not
say
the
that
direction I thought you were going
I
to go about
say
this.
that with the best, most heartfelt warmth in my heart towards you for that, because constantly we would just be chatting about theology, and I would say something that was insanely ridiculous, and you would immediately be like, "You should post that online." You should write a blog about that. And I'm like, dude, that will get me in so much trouble. And you're like, I know. Like, you would always be never ever. I would turn around and go, Jared, maybe why don't you post it? Never did you ever say anything that was like ever sketchy, questionable, anything. But you always were giving me that little nudge. So I think of you as this side of me that encourages out the most devious, naughty side of me, in the best of ways, because that was always fun. Always fun.
It's true. You would come into my room with these half-baked status posts, and you're like, "What do you think?"
Yeah,
knowing that I would, knowing that I would encourage you to do it, and it was like this spiral.
Yeah, you always there's types of people that go around all their friends asking their opinion until they get the answer they want. I didn't have to do that, because in my house was you, and you would immediately give me the answer I wanted, which was, yeah, you should totally post what. I was trying to think of one of my worst statuses was which has done the most damage, the Left Behind Bible or the Left Behind books or the Satanic Bible. And
that one has never left my memory.
Blew up. Like, I had like 10 people on Facebook, and I think I got like 800 like comments. It was just insane. But yeah,
you were definitely going after eschatology at that point, and just going, which one has I think you said, which one has damaged the church more?
Yes. Oh, there you go.
People didn't like it.
I love it. Well, why don't you try and save yourself by giving yourself a bit of an introduction for people that don't know who you are, that otherwise will just know you as the devil on my shoulder. Maybe a different kind of bio would be more palatable for most, probably.
That makes sense. Yeah. So after being the voice on your shoulder, I am a husband, and we'll get to that later about who my wife is and your role in that. I've got 2 kids, a 4-year-old boy and a 2-year-old girl. I am a PhD candidate in New Testament biblical studies at King's College here in London. As you can tell with the accent, I'm not British, but I'm married, a Brit, and we moved here so we could do my studies. And that's a bit about me right now.
Why did you choose to do studies in? Was it because Kezia is like from and around London? You were like, it's a cool place to go. It works. She's closer to home. Or was there a specific reason you chose King's College?
Yeah. Interestingly, it was fully my idea. And she wanted to stay in the States first. Oh, wow. When I brought it up. It was me that was like, wait, we could move. And she was like, whoa. I'm not ready for that yet. So when I started looking at PhD programs, I figured out something kind of crazy. The way the UK and maybe Europe, but at least the UK and the States do PhDs is very different. Okay. In the States, you have to start with, after your master's, a decent amount of coursework, where you're like actually going to classes, and you've got professors, and you're writing papers, and you're doing exams and things. And then after you do maybe a year and a half, maybe even 2 years, depending on your pace of coursework, then you start your dissertation.
Oh, wow.
And so PhDs in the States can tend to take a bit longer, whereas in the UK, they expect you to be further along in the content and your kind of familiarity with what's out there and your research, that you just go straight into your dissertation. And it's basically a 3-year paper that you write. And I was like, that sounds way better, like absolutely way better. It took me 5 years to finish my MDiv. So I was done with classes, 4 years of an undergrad, 5 years of a grad. I was like 9 years of courses after high school. And I was like, let's just get straight to that dissertation. And so, yeah, it was a combo of that. I like the way they do it here. And then honestly, just moving to the UK is kind of a dream. It's just awesome here.
Yeah.
I love it. And it helps that we also get to be with kids' family, get the kids to be with the grandparents. It's a huge plus. So,
yeah. But the weather, not so much. Coming from California to England. This is why Cassie was like, no, I just left there. Yeah.
Pretty major adjustment. I've lived in Texas and California. So it's basically all warm,
so not prepared.
Sunny climates. Yeah. I've been putting my flannel closet to serious use here, just pulling it out basically like August to March.
Yeah.
Solid flannel.
I hear you. Dude, so you went straight into this fascinates me because it's something people ask me all the time is like, Phil, will you go like into some sort of like more formal academic thing? And part of me like dreams of getting to do what you do. Like I literally would like love to be able to do it because I get to do this to like the smallest degree, but I'm constantly distracted by 110 different things. And there's no actual formal recognition for any study I do whatsoever. And part of me is like, I'd love to just do that, work on some sort of theory, principle, and walk away with this. But is this something that, like, so for me, it's just like, it's how I beat, it's how I work, it's how I operate. Is this something that was how you've always operated, how you've always kind of ticked? You've always kind of been like, nah, I'm like an academic at heart. I like to look at things. I like to take things apart. I like to study things as far as people study them and then keep going. Is that something that's been quite normal for you? Is that something that was kind of part of your upbringing, or is that something you developed a passion for?
Yeah, I'd say I have a mixed answer on that. I'd say I've always been excited and interested in theology and discussing.
Mm-hmm.
We used to do that for hours and hours. We started a whole group about that, and so I was at least inclined to it so much that I would join groups and would enjoy discussing theology, but I wasn't an academic, that's for sure.
Mm.
My grades in college were mediocre, in high school were mediocre, and it was fine, but I was not like, wow, some, budding academic who's clearly a prodigy. It was like, it was never in my sight, but I think I found that I just kept wanting to know more and kept wanting to go deeper. So I was like, all right, let me try this MDiv thing. And it felt out of my league. I felt like, man, I haven't written a paper in years because there was a gap between my undergrad and that. And I had no biblical education. I took an undergrad in liberal arts and like communications. It was completely unconnected. But I was like, let me just try this MDiv thing. And, and then you just kind of learn to write academically a bit, and you start to get some of the the language, so to speak, and I found out I enjoyed it. And then by the end of it, I was like, man, I really like this. And the next step, if I want to keep doing this, is a PhD. And to kind of something you mentioned earlier, one of my frustrations in my master's was that courses are like 4 months, maybe 3.5. And it's like, we're going to look at, Christology and pneumatology for these 4 months. And then, read these 5 books and write these 5 papers, and, make sure you use 10 or 15 sources per paper. And you're like, and you're doing 2 other courses at the same time. And so you're like blazing through these topics that you could spend a lifetime researching. Yeah. And so you're writing a paper that's 1 inch deep, just enough to give them their 10 sources. And then you have to move on to the next topic. And so it's like, all right, I've mastered pneumatology in 4 months, and let's move on to the next thing. And I was, obviously that's the model they have to do to give you a master's.
To cover a broad sort of like range of things.
No criticism there, but I my constant frustration was like, I'd like to just stay on something for a little bit longer and not have to move off it so quickly. Like I can see the depths available there. And a PhD is, you're forced to go deeper than you ever thought you could or would even want to on a topic, to truly become an expert on something. And so, it's been, like you said, it's a dream to be forced to only stay within a certain area and to have to, read basically everything that's been ever written that's relevant to your topic, or at least be familiar with it. Yeah. It's amazing. For some people that sounds like a nightmare.
Sure.
But I think I've just like, man, let me actually go deep on something. But one point I would want to make is that I'm not a natural academic, and I would want to say that to people that think they're not a natural, and that would keep them away from it. It's just like, I would say the one thing you need is to be able to persevere in hard work. If you don't have a hard work ethic, then you can't do it. You have to be able to grit your teeth and do 40-hour weeks of stuff that's just like, even when you're really bored and you don't want to do it anymore, that's the thing that's tough. But I don't think there's a natural academic gift that makes it to where you could or couldn't do a PhD. Now, there are some people that you come across like, dude, you are nuts, like you're super smart. And that's not me.
Most people are insane.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think it was natural for me, but I maybe naturally like it.
Sure. So I guess this is something that fascinates me is, to me, one of the keys is just inquisitiveness, right? Wanting to learn, wanting to grow, wanting to expose yourself to new ideas, all these different things is like, it's such a core undergirded like kind of element of academia. Like one of the things that I grew up in a church kind of environment, multiple different types of churches and denominations that probably stood on the shoulders of academia, but didn't really know it did. And also probably stood on the shoulders of 70, 80 years old stuff. Like and this is the thing that jumped out at me when I kind of started moving into the world of kind of like scholarly writing, scholarly exploration of whatever it is, different New Testament theologies, just even language and stuff, like some of the things that we're discovering and moving into, and you're like, wait, what? We just don't acknowledge anything that's happened in the last 50 years. It's like, well, we do, but it's almost like there's this gap between people that can explain it really academically and then people that can explain it so someone actually understands it on the whole. Like there's this like gap of decades where it kind of filters down bit by bit by bit by bit. And until someone's like, oh, I can actually explain that to like a, generic person that's busy with their job doing, whatever, 9 to 5. And they're like, spell it out to me, Rob Bell, in a really well-written, easy to read book. Right. And so to me, someone like Rob or something, you can tell he's doing very good, very hard work in some of the things he studied, but the way he communicates it is in no way, shape, or form at that level. And it shows because everyone goes, holy crap, this guy's making a lot of sense. To what degree, what led you to go, I want to go into that level? Like, because for me, it's going, I don't want to be 50, 60, 70 years behind. I'm like a pioneer, right? I want the new iPhone before it's out. And even if it's a bit broken, I want to see what it's like. And I think that's what it is for me, is I'm like, I want to know what the latest ideas are, what are the latest kind of theological implications of faith, of whatever. But most people are fairly content to kind of like, you could have studied all day, all night, in between working and being a family man and stuff. You could have when Kezia went to sleep at night, you could pick out your book and read like interesting books, and you could have studied not at this level. What was it that pushed you into kind of like the academic level? Because it is a whole nother kettle of fish. Like I think no one would claim otherwise. I don't think. Certainly it is for me when I'm trying to read stuff in that world. Yeah,
no, you're right. It's different. And I think some of it is it's personality, and it's not necessarily a positive thing. It can be a vice, and it can be a gift. But you probably know me as the type that's like, I'm not going to speak my mind on something unless I'm really confident about it and really sure. And if I know just a little bit about something, I'm going to feel like probably a fake if I'm going to teach on it. Like I know that there's this much more to be known. And so to get up and lecture on it, I'm not going to like build a plan while I'm flying and it's going, I think it's going to work. I'm like, I want to like really know my stuff. to kind of build this foundation. It's the same thing. Like my wife always kids me. I won't do something in front of people unless I've like practiced for hours behind the scenes. I'm like this not competitive guy unless it's something that I'm remotely good at, and then I'm going to try and be the best, and I'm going to practice for like hundreds of hours behind the scenes. So this is the same thing that translates here. That's like, if I'm going to do this, and if I'm going to, you know, head into eventually writing books on theology or biblical studies or whatever, or I lecture, I want to go ahead and hit the highest mark of what is asked of scholars, and you know, jump through those hoops and be forced to learn Greek at an academic level, and crazily enough, it's having to be German too, which is absolutely breaking my mind that I'm having to do that. But so for me, it's a bit of a personality of like, it gives me confidence on topics. And then, like you said, there's that inquisitiveness. I love the depth it requires of you. And you made a good point. Like, I think there's this kind of conversation out there that says formal education isn't really necessary, and you know, you can kind of just be self-taught. And while I would say that's possible, the level you're pushed is like, you'd have to be special, really special, and so motivated to learn at the level and the depth and the breadth that's required of you, especially when it comes to languages. If there's no deadline and there's no test coming up, or no supervisor that's going to listen to you say something in a language, like if none of those things are hanging there in front of you to keep motivated and keep pushing and keep going deeper, I certainly wouldn't have been able to do that. And so I think it's hopefully, it's taking me to a place on a few topics that I just wouldn't have had the discipline to do by myself. And again, there are exceptions. There's people who just go, I don't need to pay the money for it, and I'll completely be that disciplined and have PhD equivalent knowledge on a topic. And I'm like, you're amazing.
Sure. Yeah.
That's
I can think of people like that fall into that bracket. But what's funny is most of them have PhDs as well, just because, you know, well, they did that, but then now they're like, you know, like the level that they're studying day in, day out, and the material that they're producing and stuff like that, but they're not officially affiliated with an academic institution anymore, or, you know, things like that. So, but it does seem that most people have forged themselves through that. The person I'm thinking of most in my mind is Michael Hardin. I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Hardin. Genius, absolute genius. And he's the reason I can even begin to look at the Greek texts, because he taught me Greek 3 times a week for like an hour plus, you know, for a year and a half. We just, every single week, we just sat down, and the degree that you learn when you're whistling like that. Like I wanted to learn Greek. I mean, right when we were in Bible school together, like a decade ago, I'm sure I mentioned to you, I'm going to learn Greek at some point, probably dozens of times. And here I am like 2 years ago, and I'm like, okay, I'm actually going to start. And actually, I didn't even really, I messaged him and I was like, hey, Michael, because he made a message. He just made a comment in passing. He says, like, people that learn Greek in like university, he says, they don't actually have any idea how to actually read Greek and translate or anything. He's like, they've learned like a Mickey Mouse quick course on like how to like read a few words here and there, and then just open up a concordance and pick their favorite words. And he's like, they don't actually know the grammatical complexities, the history, you know, they don't know how the words are used in extra biblical and canonical like texts. And he's like, they just don't know. And so I messaged him, I was like, dude, you're beating up hard on people that can do this. I'm like, how do you recommend you do it? And he's like, I'll start teaching on Tuesday at 9 a.m. And I was like, shit, right? I was like, I hadn't really thought of committing to this, but I was like, I can't turn it down at the same time. Do you know what I mean? It was just too big an opportunity. And so for me, that pushed me so hard, so fast. Like, it was incredible, the degree that I'd always kind of beat myself up and gone, I can't do that. I couldn't even do languages in school. And suddenly I struggle with English, and suddenly I'm like, oh, I'm like translating like, you know, 1 John. Like, holy crap. I'm holding a copy of 1 John that I translated, and it looks pretty accurate. you know?
Amazing.
And so it's incredible what that like external pressure, a pressure of having a mentor, the pressure of having systems in place to kind of move you forward. Absolutely. Like that's a huge factor. Do you think
and that's a good point. Yeah, you can have informal structures like that push you. So I'm not in the least trying to say that there's a whole nother level reserved for people who go through a system and no one else does that. That's just been the case for me. But you're right. I mean, accessing someone like Michael Hardin to teach you and have someone push you, I mean, that'll absolutely
and he's done it at those high levels. You know, he's done it at the very highest kind of levels of what it looks like to kind of like engage with Greek text. Like, I mean, he is a genius on those levels. And so, you know, people contact him to go, hey, I'd like to run this by you. You know, some of the biggest names in theological writings that I've come across, you're like, oh, they sent their advanced copy of their latest script, you know, their latest paper or whatever to Michael Hardin for his input. You know, you're like, oh, wow. Yeah, I need to have Michael Hardin on this podcast, actually. I really do.
Good idea.
But I think this is one of the sticking elements, because like I was saying, like the grand amount of people, the vast majority of people, they've got lives to do. They've got, you know, stuff going on. Like I often say, like even for pastors, the grand amount of pastors, the majority of pastors, they maybe went to seminary and learned a little bit here or there, and a lot can be said for and against kind of like more kind of institutional kind of places of learning. However, most of them, week in, week out, unless you're like at a huge organization where you're the teaching pastor, you've got to visit sick people. You've got to go to the hospital. You've got to marry people. You've got to like mentor a bunch of people in your church. You've got to do a lot of stuff. You're running like 8 different groups a week, you know. You don't have time to sit there and, you know, brush up on your Koine Greek. You don't have time to, you know, read J. Lou Martin's Galatians. Like that's not going to happen. Right. And so do you think that what do you think is the kind of middle ground for people that are like trying to engage at those kind of, they want to go into those deeper levels, but they're not going to pick up Deliverance from God, a 1,300 page book, and flick through it. You know, there's got to be, because do you think people are missing out? I guess that's my thing, because that's how I went into this world, because I felt like I was missing out. But it feels very unfair in a sense, especially when we talk about it from a very spiritual perspective of like, it's a bit unfair of God to like kind of have this like barrier of like, well, if you really want to know this stuff, you're going to have to like get a PhD. Do you know what I'm saying there? How do you navigate that kind of dynamic, and how do you see people that aren't in academic community being able to engage with that kind of world and what's going on?
Man, that's a crucial question. So some of it for me is how I view the nature and the function of the church and how it should operate in terms of just being a team. I do not think everyone, if they were really responsible, would have would develop a basic understanding of Greek. Like, no, that's super unrealistic. And that's, as you said, unfair. And so I think we all have to kind of go, all right, what is our role to play in contribution to the wider community? And so for people who look at me and go, like, Jared, what you're doing sounds terrible and boring. And like, how do you live with yourself? Just spending 3 years on like one chapter of the Bible, like your life sounds the worst. And I go, yeah, great. I'm built differently and I was designed to love it. And what you do, I probably hate it. And it sounds terrible too, but lean on me to dive into this topic way more than you want to. And then I'll come back with a few scraps and say, hey, this might be beneficial. And then you can, you know, we can all serve each other with our own gifts. And, you know, the local pastors who are doing the baby dedications and the baptisms and the funerals and stuff, I'm like, I don't want to do any of that stuff. That sounds hard or meetings all day and doing counseling. I'm like, that just, I would last like 3 weeks doing that job. But somehow I last 3 years reading academic journals and stuff. I'm like, so somehow I think we have to be willing to kind of lean on each other and not expect everyone to operate at that level. Because, you know, when you read someone like David Bentley Hart, who has a crazy understanding of the Greek,
absolutely.
that sometimes people's criticism is like, you've created this gap that just makes it to where like no one can actually understand the New Testament like you. And so that almost is an argument against his reading, is that there's a barrier that God wouldn't have created for this time or whatever. But I think we just go, no, actually, instead find these people who have, you know, devoted their lives to this, and then pull on them in that way. And if you so desire to do a bit of it yourself, so you can actually have the thrill of reading a bit of Greek and going, oh my gosh, I just understood that verse, which is a crazy feeling when you first do that. The first verse you translate, you're like, I'm a god, I'm a genius. I think then you just make sure to read like one level above you or two levels, and then know that those people are reading a level above them. And you know, this is that thing you said at the very beginning. A lot of us are kind of standing on the invisible structure of the academic world, whether we went to the academy ourselves, or we read people who were in the academy themselves. It's kind of like it's there to serve the church, and it should benefit the church, but everyone doesn't need to take part in it or learn basic Greek or Hebrew. I don't know a lick of Hebrew, and I'm fully relying on Old Testament scholars or Hebrew Bible scholars.
And I'm not even going to go there.
No. And I just have to go, that's your specialty, and I'm going to let you do your thing, and I'll do mine.
No, it's really interesting. One of the things that fascinates me is, and this probably goes hand in hand with my own personal journey of kind of, you know me, and you know, even a decade ago, I was like, oh, what parts do I believe that I can just completely unravel and ruin, because I'm fascinated about learning new ideas, new concepts, new ways of seeing things. I've always been a bit like that, but that's escalated and grown and developed as the years have gone on. And I know you've kind of seen that from a distance to some degree. But I think one of the things that fascinated me looking into the academic community was how differently it was structured to most of my experiences of churches. In that most of the academic community, when it comes to approaching theology, is, oh, obviously we don't know who's right. We're just looking at all these different ideas, and we're kind of grabbing one idea and going, I'm going to explore this to the nth degree, and hopefully I'll prove my thesis, I'll prove my point. But actually, if I prove it to be wrong, and it might be someone else's, that's a good positive move as well. But it's almost, it's a scientific method in a sense, isn't it? It's going, well, we're holding all of this quite lightly because we don't know a lot of this. Whereas it feels like in day-to-day, the church across most of the kind of Western Protestant denominations, and maybe beyond that even, there's an element of needing to make sure we have the right belief and prove we have the right belief, that there isn't that openness to different views and beliefs. How was that something that you were surprised by, that you enjoyed, that you struggled with? Like, how did you engage? Because I know that you've come from probably more charismatic background, right? So it's a fairly fundamental approach to doctrine on the whole. You know, in other ways, it can be quite broad and liberal in their approaches in certain things. But as far as understanding the Bible and reading the Bible and how we interpret the Bible, it can be quite fundamental. Was that quite a shock for you, going from that into a world where that probably wasn't going to get you very far, unless you were in a very subset of, you know, that academic world?
Yeah, no, definitely. There was certainly some shocking moments for me when you kind of learn that in the academic world, even in New Testament, there's everything is up for debate. Everything is questioned and has to be defended. I mean, my supervisor, his you know, one of his biggest works, and it was his his dissertation was on a Pauline Christology, where there's this massive debate of, did Paul think Jesus was God? And you're like, well, duh. And then you read a few articles of people saying absolutely not, and here's why, using the New Testament as their sources, and you're like, what? It's like absolutely everything is debated, and their arguments are supported really well. But anyways, I'm getting a bit off track, but that was one of my early shocking moments. I was like, wait, they're debating what? I thought that was like super crystal clear. But yeah, I think one of the pieces that's complicated, with the contrast between the academy and the church would be the pastoral responsibility of leaders with what they're teaching. It doesn't mean that that justifies a dogmatic approach. It does mean there's maybe there's maybe greater consequences on their beliefs, and that being communicated, and they might see that play out more, and they might see the fruit of their work a bit more. For me, like, I'm well aware that when I write my PhD and I turn it in a couple of years, it's not being written, like, no one on the planet is going to grab my PhD and put it on their nightstand and go, and then like read through it. And like, no one's going to read it and go like, I plan on being blessed by this, and it's going to like encourage me. It's going to be dense, and basically it's written so that a bunch of other scholars and people who are going to write their PhD on Galatians can disagree with it. They're all going to try and find where they part ways with me. So I'm basically feeding it to sharks once it's printed, so that people can then pick it apart and find the ways that they think I'm wrong. And there's going to be all these, if it's worth reading, then it will be picked apart and sharpened, which I think is really healthy. I think that's the part of the academic world that I love, is the assumption that everyone's going to think really critically about whatever you write, and their respect for you or their love for you has very little to do with what they think about what you wrote. And they can just, tear one of your ideas to shreds and show how you're completely wrong, and they just love you to death. And then they're like, and you're an amazing scholar, and you've benefited the world of biblical studies, but I completely did disagree with you, and you're completely wrong. And I think that's definitely a bit different than how the church functions.
Well, we don't cope with disagreement on those levels either, like, very well. We take it very personally at times, because I think a lot of it is because these aren't, this is your life, right? You pour into this for 3 years. As even that, you've probably poured into this a few years prior, like thinking and framing and gearing up for something like, so this is like 5 years, 6 years of your life, like poured into this one document. And then someone goes, Jared, that's bullshit, dude, you're an idiot. And you're like, So of course, there's always going to be some of those elements of humanity within it. But but when you're approaching things as an academic, and you're putting forth things as scholarly works, you're not necessarily inherently wrapping up your being and your eternal security and all these other elements, and how good a teacher you are, how good a pastor you are, how safe you are making people, how you're equipping people for eternity, like all these kind of things. So that if you say to a pastor, that's wrong, your message was completely wrong last Sunday, they are going to go, oh, but that is what I'm basing my eternity on. It's what I'm going to be judged twice as severely on that, based on whatever.
Totally.
There's so much emotion and spiritual identity ingrained in what we believe when you kind of take a step out of that academic kind of world to some degree. I know, I mean, a lot of academics, this is interwoven with their faith. And I'm sure you would say that that is heavily the case for you. Like what you're writing about is somewhat woven into how you believe, how you interact with God, how you see the world. But it is an interesting dynamic. And I'm thinking of like you describing this like kind of teamwork, this body, like, look, you're a pastor, you're here to pastor people, not to give the greatest kind of expository working on Philippians that's ever existed. If you did that, it'd be bloody impressive, but we're not expecting this from you. It's okay if you're going to go visit Barbara, who's dying in the hospital, and her family, like, please do that. Because I don't know what to do. I would be rubbish in that environment. But in the same sense, I do wonder if we can all recognize that different people have these different gifts and they're all a different part of the body, that kind of analogy, the Corinthians kind of analogy of body parts. I do wonder at times if the church has kind of on some level forsaken the value of academia though. And I think to some degree, this is potentially why it's so far behind in its communication of where the majority of academia are. If you look at what the average church in America is preaching, it's probably, like I said, a few decades behind. I don't know if you would agree with that interpretation or not, but that's my perspective. And I do wonder if part of that is because we don't really value academia, and it needs to filter down until it comes from someone we do value, until someone that we see as one of those big pastors that's great at explaining things, like with Rob Bell, John Piper, whichever branch you're in, you've got these people that will read their book and they're maybe feeding on certain things. And so eventually it gets in. Would you agree that that's maybe something that's in play within a good portion of the church, that there isn't a value for people that are invested in doing academic work and their findings? Or would you disagree with that?
So I haven't experienced interpersonal dialogue on, feeling devalued from leaders saying, what are you doing going into the institution to do that? You shouldn't do that. You should just turn your mind off and just think more with your heart. Like I haven't encountered that, thankfully. However, I do think, or I have seen an unawareness of the structure that they're standing on, which can then result in comments that devalue scholars and theologians. Sometimes scholars and theologians can be kind of the off the cuff enemy in a sermon. It's like, well, theologians can say all they want, blah, 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 but blah, blah, blah. And they'll kind of put them in a camp of like people who get too wrapped up in their head and, aren't really like being led by the Spirit. And so scholars may say this or that, but we know, blah, blah, blah. And when those moments happen, I go, this is interesting, because we're all, eating from and living from this thing that's been handed to us by hundreds and hundreds of years of intense, deep academic work. Every translation we read is because someone had to go ultra deep into the biblical languages for us. And so I think I have seen an unawareness of, as you've worded it, of the shoulders we're standing on. And then that kind of plays out in like, well, we don't really need them. And it's like, meanwhile, we're like balancing on top of them. But, in my experience, thankfully, I haven't had people say, what you're doing isn't beneficial or something like that. But it is part of my long-term desire to kind of create that mutual value, because I think the academy can also look down from their noses at people in pastoral work or in missions and go, how can they not get this stuff? And then sit with arms crossed while their teacher tries to teach a text that they know way better. And you made a good point. It's like, yeah, well, we shouldn't want them to have to know the 6 debates on the topic because then they wouldn't take care of Barbara in the hospital.
Sure.
So I think, which, by the way, my church leaders, I'm blessed, are great at teaching, and they have been giving awesome messages. But I do think I want to see that gap bridged a bit, and that mutual value of like, wow, we need what you're doing. Otherwise, our theology never hits the ground, and it doesn't play out, and we don't see it work out in the community. And you need academics to spend years in trenches that you think are boring, and then kind of come back with spoils and say, hey, here's what's going to be beneficial for you to learn. And that's something that's really fun is the deeper you dive into stuff, the more you see the ripples of how something really small can play out into everyday life in all these different areas that you believe. And it might seem just really small and insignificant, but it actually, it's of huge significance.
No, it's fascinating, isn't it? And like, man, there's so many different directions I'm thinking of going in. But something I was always struck by was coming across the sheer quantities. When we started discovering in the last kind of 100 years, we discovered so many new manuscripts of different texts. But you start discovering, oh my gosh, the early church was so freaking diverse, and what Christianity has become. That wasn't the only group that came out of Jesus and his followers. Like, there were so many groups, and that's just the group that kind of won the argument. And why they won the argument could possibly, we don't really know, but you could almost potentially boil it down to, they were in Rome. They had the money, the power, and the structure. And that's why they beat the Gnostics and the Ebionites and all, there's so many different groups. But what's fascinating is we largely didn't overly know that there were that many different groups. And if we did, we didn't really know what they believed as much and things like that, because largely we just didn't have many of their writings. And if we did, they were just fragments here or there. And we're like, they were probably quite similar, but just believed a slight different thing here. And so it's just so fascinating how these little things suddenly blow stuff wide open, which then mean, oh my gosh, I have to completely reevaluate the first 400 years of Christianity, which was largely based on one person's writing, because we only had kind of one church historian and they were 400 years in, I'm oversimplifying that whole topic, of course, but I think like it's these little things, but generally speaking, 9 out of 10 Christians isn't going to really ever know that that's a conversation, that's a debate, that's an entire wing of academia. I mean, first couple of centuries of history within the church is a massive branch of study, with thousands and thousands of people doing hard work day in, day out, dedicating their lives just to that time period. And yet, Steve and his church is probably never going to hear anything about that from the pulpit. And largely, maybe he doesn't need to, because how much does it really change his day in, day out, how he does his life? The question I have is, there's got to be some sort of balance. I heard, I think it was Bart Ehrman, who's I think he's a great example of someone that's working at the high tier levels of academia, but is actually able to communicate that in very understandable and easy to read. Whatever you believe about his different conclusions and things like that, but the way he puts that across is a fantastic example of maybe some of these middle men that I think we're needing. But something he put across once was, he was saying, I don't need pastors every Sunday to give like a message that completely deconstructs who Jesus in the early church was, and and sends everyone into spirals everywhere to go, oh my God, there is no God. Or he's like, that, like, an academic can live in that world, and they're so in that world that it doesn't necessarily even affect their faith to such a degree, because they're like, well, no, we're just looking at it from this perspective, and that's fine. Sure. But you give that to, like, again, Steve, who's just sitting on the third row, the row he's been in every week, he just has a meltdown when he hears it. But Bart was saying, like, I don't need that to be like what pastors preach every Sunday. He's like, that's impractical. It's not helpful. It's just not something that anyone should really expect from a general preacher. But he was saying one of the issues is that the preacher pretends that it doesn't exist, and I think it's almost the sweeping under the rug of academia that I think. It's not that most things that are being studied right now are probably not that relevant, probably not that applicable or translatable yet anyway. We're still wait another decade or so for it all to kind of filter down and what are the implications and stuff. But there is this element of like, oh no, this isn't even a debate. So you have people going, oh no, there's no debate. It's 100% the earth is 6,000 years old. And I'm like, dude, like that's one way to approach things, but it's certainly a debate, or whatever, or there's no debate. It's 100%, that this passage is literal or that passage is metaphorical. It's like, dude, 100% guarantee whatever passage you're pointing to, there's a debate. Someone out there is starting to go, let's look at it a different way. Like, do you see that as problematic that the churches, and I say church so broadly because the vast majority of church is not even playing this in this world, but in doing so, they're ignoring these conversations. They're ignoring that there's stuff we don't know about the Bible. There's stuff we don't know about Christianity. We're still exploring and learning and growing and evolving. And it feels like a lot of day-to-day Christianity wants to not know that, doesn't want to engage with that concept, wants to think, well, Christianity is finished. We've figured it out. And it happens to be my denomination that's figured it out perfectly. It happens to be in my denomination that my pastor knows it exactly perfectly the best. I just need to listen to that. Do you see problems with that kind of model, or do you think that's just part of the way it works and it just is, and it will change over time and it will slowly kind of adapt? Do you know what I mean? How do you see that dynamic?
Yeah. I think I would end up having a much more informed answer if I, tried to be a senior leader for a couple of years and then answer it. But from the outside looking in, I think that there's a lot of dynamics in play. If you're leading and you're shutting down questions from other people, maybe in the leadership team or in the church, and you're kind of squashing dissenting voices on topics, that's a problem. I think open-minded teaching and leadership is really healthy. And, you can have a few non-negotiables as long as they're creedal. And then after that, like, welcoming in openness creates, it disciples people who are thinkers, and you want to train people to think. You don't want to train everyone to have to learn Greek, but just to how to think critically, I think is super healthy. So if they create an environment where people feel free to think, I think that's really great. I think it's helpful when pastors, maybe occasionally, once every couple months, they do take a few moments to mention a larger debate and how this could be viewed in another way that I disagree with, but actually there's a fair point here and you might want to look at this more deeply. I think that would be really healthy, and certain members of the congregation will eat that up and go, oh yes, I'm going to look at that topic. I love that, he or she spoke on this and said that. So I think it's a problem if it's being squashed. And like you said, when you've got to know where the church is, not geographically, but in their narrative. If they've just gone through 3 church splits and they're this age demographic or that, you don't want them to just go, and guess what, this isn't true. And you gotta like,
there's a question of if Paul even thought Jesus was God.
Exactly. You're like, which, spoiler alert, he did, thankfully. But yeah, so I think you've got to check all those things. But then I think if you're discipling people who can think, like that's such a big deal. That's so helpful. But if you're squashing that's a problem.
I think it's interesting because I feel like we're at a very interesting time in history. In that, when the book and the printing press came across, it's no coincidence that that's when we had this huge reformation and people's ideas and opinions just radically shifted and changed. And I think we're in a time today of the internet. Like I say all the time, like so many leaders come to me and go like, oh, like what can I do about people leaving my church? And I'm like, first of all, you got to stop pretending you know all the answers, because the second you say something as an absolute, half the congregation have typed it into Google and hit send and found out you're talking bullshit before you finish your sentence, right? I mean, it's all, they've got the answer to every question on their phone, give or take. I'm being a bit facetious with that, but like, and it's fascinating how I think we're in a completely new era. And I think this is actually a big part of why I think more and more people are looking to the academy, to people that are a little bit more scholarly, a little bit more open with maybe how they approach topics and try and present topics a bit more openly. It's why I'm trying to do that as much as I can. I just read a great study by a guy called Josh Packard, who did he did a study that he kind of labeled church refugees, and it's on the de-churched kind of movement of people that are leaving church, which is a kind of overlap with the kind of group that I'm working with. A lot of people leave church that I work with, and a lot of people don't, but maybe they've left it a little bit intellectually on some level. But it's fascinating. They studied over 1,000 people, and they did literally interviews with over 1,000 people across loads of different denominations across the world, because they decided not to go for the quantitative and more qualitative methods, which is like, you kind of have to do it with something like this, but my God, it's a lot of work. And so they interviewed over 1,000 people, and they had all these theories going in, and they were like, oh, they're going to have been offended and hurt by someone in church, or maybe they just like got a bit lukewarm and didn't care anymore, or maybe they like went to uni and like found out they're not so sure and then just drifted on, or maybe they married a non-Christian spouse and they just didn't really care anymore. All their hypotheses proved not to be true. And in fact, some of them they couldn't prove once out of thousands. The idea that someone just gets hurt and left, like they couldn't find one person that just got hurt and left. Anyone that left because they were like, oh yeah, I've been hurt, was like systematically hurt in multiple choices over like years. These people really believed in the church and hung on. The point I'm making is the number one thing that they found across the whole boards, I think it was like, I can't remember what percentage, but it's like right up there in the 90s, was that people wanted to have a conversation about beliefs rather than be dictated to about beliefs. And they wanted a community where they could discuss and be open and go, well, I think a bit differently. And what they found across the board, this group of people, was that they were struggling to find churches where they could do that. Most of the churches were going, no, this is what we believe, or this is what you should believe. Don't start asking that question. And I think what that's doing is pushing a whole new branch of Christianity out of churches and towards people like Bart Ehrman and N.T. Wright, and people that are kind of these middlemen that are trying to kind of get academic discussions into the layman's hands. And I think that's a really exciting proposition in some ways. I know for the average church leader, that's quite a scary proposition. I think there's a lot to be learned from it. Like you're saying, don't be a church that does that. Start encouraging conversation. But it's not quite so easy when that's your kind of mindset, I'm sure. But do you think that, obviously you've not been in this world for too long, but do you think that there is a shift in the way that academia is approached? Like when I look at like books I've found easy to read by academics, they quickly like drop off around like the mid 80s, early 90s. Like there's just none. Like they're all like, oh my God, this is now like wading through treacle. Like it's just a nightmare. Whereas in modern times around now, like, I mean, you've got some of the smartest minds on the planet writing blogs, And so it's like, I'm working on this thesis and this huge project with like multiple people working on it to try and figure it out. But in my spare time, I'll bash out a blog every other week. And you're like, holy crap, this is one of the most advanced, smartest minds on the planet on this topic, giving us a 500-word blog every 2 weeks. Do you see that becoming I guess, do you have thoughts on that shift? And if because I think culturally we are shifting towards more asking more questions, being a bit more open. Do you think that, what do you think is in place within academia to meet that need? Do you think that's something that people are dealing with intentionally, or is it, do you see people rising up to fill in those kind of middle grounds?
I mean, yeah, you're right that I can only speak with a certain level of confidence on this, having been in this world for however long I've been here. So, but I would say the game has changed, and I don't want to speak to motive too much, but I think with, social media being one of the main ways that people get the word out for books and publications and stuff, if you aren't writing content that is relatable and able to be kind of put out in bite-sized chunks, then no one's going to buy your books, and you're going to get no sales, and no one's going to read what you're saying. You're going to have a few scholars who interact with you, and then you might find that you've been disagreed with a few times in footnotes, and then that's like your academic career is like, yeah, well, this guy's wrong, and here's why. But I think you've got to, if you want your work to get out there and you want it to make its way into the hands of everyone, you've got to be able to do that. I was just recommending a book to a friend today, and I was reading up on kind of what the book was, and it was like, this guy wrote his dissertation, his PhD dissertation, and then he did the classic thing of you then get it published by a publisher in a slightly different format, but it's basically the exact same content. And then now this is a new version that's a popular level version, so it's like the third level of publication. But you've got to do that, otherwise it just gets filed away into on a bookshelf in a academic library somewhere. So I don't know if that's getting directly to what you're asking, but
I don't know what I was asking, if I'm honest, but that feels like a good answer to who do you
then
think
that
is
was
doing
the
this
answer.
well? Who's doing it well? Like, who do you look at and go, dang, they are doing it really well, where they're putting out some of the most important work, but actually it's not just fizzling away? Because I'm sure there are probably some academic works in there. If we could troll through all of history, we'd be like, holy crap, we missed some gold here. And it's because they just didn't get published well or read well. And, like we could look at some of the greats of our time today. I think of someone like Doug Campbell, like we talked about, some of his works, incredible, but very few people are going to read Deliverance from God. I mean, good God, I'm like, dude, get to the point. Like, seriously. Like, he takes like 400 pages to tell me what I already know, so he can then tell me what he started to think about. I'm like, dude, this is killing me, like, so killing me. But he then writes phenomenal, his book on Apostle Paul that just talks about Paul's life and how we can piece together who Paul was historically and what it was like, and what we can most likely know about his life. I'm like, this is fantastic. It's a page turner. I'm literally was like, I was tearing through it, and I was like, and of course that isn't a direct reflection on the deliverance of God necessarily. But like, who do you think is doing really well in that world?
Well, the obvious one who's absolutely crushing it is N.T. Wright. I mean, he is at the top of the game in the academic world, and a lot of people haven't read it or don't know that it's out there. But I mean, he's got loads and loads of academic books that are like, really like the vocabulary is completely different. And the footnotes take up half the page, and it's like real deal scholarly work. And then he also has his New Testament for Everyone commentary series. That's like little devotional booklets, and he's been doing that for multiple decades now, writing popular level. Honestly, I would say he's been doing it before the system has required it. He's been writing so that everyone can read it for a while, before everyone was having to do their Instagram quotes. He's been doing this forever. So he's someone who, when people come to me and say, I need an entrance into Paul, even though I part ways with Wright on a few things, he's someone that can kind of, you can work up the ladder, so to speak, and then try the next level of content.
He's such a safe entry level as well, because on the whole, most Christians across most denominations are going to read N.T. Wright and probably not end up hurling the book across the table going like, heretic.
Exactly.
His conclusions are fairly in line with where a lot of people are gonna be anyway on the whole, right? So it's not like, I mentioned Bart Ehrman or something, like you read here, you're like, what do you mean? That person didn't even exist. Damn you, Bart. It's like, why are you taking this from me? And so it's such a different kind of like where he's exposing conversations that a lot of people just aren't remotely willing to start having. Someone like N.T. Wright is is a very, in my opinion, a very safe kind of stepping stone into that world as well, I think. Would you agree with that? I don't know, maybe not. But.
Oh, I do. And that's one of the reasons I can recommend him. It doesn't matter who asks me. I'm like, well, he's not going to offend anyone pretty much.
Which is why I don't like N.T. Wright, because I'm just like, this is all, it's very well put together, but I'm like, there's nothing in here that's challenging me to see things massively new. And that's why I'm a weird twisted person though, like we talked about earlier. Like I like being like torn apart and going, oh no, that thing I believe my whole life is wrong. Like that's what I want from someone. Even if it's wrong, I'm like, I want to explore that at least and engage with that.
And I'm guessing then you probably arrived at Wright's content maybe partway through your evolution of doctrine, because
late.
Because he does challenge people who are early on, and they
that's true. Exactly. It's very true.
But for you, no surprise at this point. You're not going to get anything from him that's going to rattle your cage.
No, but there's very little that rattles my cage. So I always have to think that when I'm recommending books. I'm always like, okay, where's this person at? What would be a mind-blowing thing for them? Okay, who is in that remit? Because generally speaking, like the book I most recently read, they're going to like literally just like crumble to bits and like, go, there is no God, which if that's what they have to do, I don't know, but I'm not going to push people over the cliff if they're not ready to go. They don't want to go.
Absolutely.
Who else do you think is doing good work in this area?
I mean, Campbell he's in the mix. I mean, he's working on a popular level version of Deliverance at the moment, which is exciting. And then I think he'll do, I think his new one, A Pauline Dogmatics.
How do you rate that?
It's way more readable.
Okay.
And so I think almost anyone can read that, but it's just so long. So he's even going to do, from what I hear, he's even going to do another level, like shorter. So I would be on the lookout for those. Richard Hayes. So he wrote one called Reading Backwards, and it's still slightly more on the academic spectrum, but it's to me it's one of the things that it fueled my jets, sending me into my PhD. I was like, this guy, the way he's reading the Hebrew Bible and his hermeneutic is fascinating. So Richard Hayes has a couple of things. I mean, Eugene Peterson, he
was another granddaddy of it, right? I mean, to the point where he was like, well, let's make the Bible more understandable. I mean, like, you can't go much more like, all right, let's really stun this thing down for people than like changing their Bible.
Exactly.
And anyone that has read his actual works, I mean, like, they're usually like overflowing with great things to say, like, oh my God, this changed my life. Like, I don't think nearly enough people have read his stuff, but that's a good point.
He almost did a PhD. He had an offer to do one with just like some incredible scholar, and then he actually turned it down and felt called to just minister to the church. I mean, you have to give me your opinion on this. What do you think about Walter Brueggemann?
I've not read enough.
Is he doing that?
I think I get confused sometimes because I tend to push myself and read things that I don't understand way too often. And so I do read the kind of more academic stuff where at times I then start reading something else and I'm like, oh, pretty good. I'm really engaged with this. But I actually, if I take it, or what I've done is I've recommended Brueggemann to someone before and they've gone, dude, what the hell? This is hard to understand and wrap my head around. And
definitely some of his stuff. Yeah.
I wonder sometimes if I'm like, oh, he's really easy to read because I'm comparing him to Deliverance from God or something like that, and I'm like, well, it's a lot shorter and a lot more to the point. But I think I really enjoy his stuff. So well, what I've read of it, I've only read piecemeal here and there.
He definitely has some more pastoral works, and then definitely some really complicated, heady ones. So,
Oh, it's cool. It's a good list. I'll include some of those names in the show notes so people can check them out. I'll put them in like a scale. We can like color code them from like green to red.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so funny. So tell me about your PhD. So what's brought you to where you are now, and why are you exploring what you're exploring now?
Yeah, well, I would say it started when I just got more and more passionate about how Jesus changes our reading of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament and our revelation of God. That once you accept that piece of truth, that Jesus is the definitive revelation of God and everything else needs to be checked by that, that's going to send ripples through absolutely everything you believe, and it's going to keep going and it's not going to stop. And that's just at the center of what has really changed a lot of my thinking. And so for me, once I really focused on that, I was like, okay, well, what does it mean for me to now read scripture having seen Jesus? That being my hermeneutic, what does this look like? So I wrote my master's thesis on that, and I used a lot of Richard Hayes and a few different other voices, and then that was kind of my big why, which you have to have when you're looking for your research topic is like, all right, what's my big why? Because if you don't have a really big why that you're passionate about, then you're going to hate your topic within 3 years. You're going to be like, get me away from this. This is so boring. So it needs to be something that you can anticipate. I will care about this in 3, 4, 5 years. It's almost like getting a tattoo. You're like,
this is why I'm not an academic, dude. Like, I cannot stress this enough. This last week, I've read like from 8 different topics. Like I was studying anesthesiology for like 4 hours, and I'm like,
awesome.
Wait, I was trying to read, like about some church statistics from sociologists, like about, church refugees. And I'm like, how have I gone off this trail? But it's to do with consciousness and how we think about that based on anesthesia. And I'm like, so I'm like, this is my biggest reservation for getting involved in this kind of world. But anyway, keep going. Hilarious. I'm just terrified of doing something for 3 years because I'm like, I can't do things for 3 hours.
Dude,
maybe I need the structure. Maybe that's it.
No, the biggest reason you shouldn't do one, Phil, is because you basically have to give up reading things not related to your topic unless you just happen to have loads of time.
Yeah. Honestly, dude, like I've got like 15 books around me right now and none of them are related.
You just can't do it, man. It's brutal. I have like a piling list, increasing list of books that I'll read in like 3 years. It's devastating. It's devastating. So So I had my big why, like, how does Jesus being the definitive revelation of God change everything, including the reading of the Hebrew Bible? And I ended up talking to who would now be my supervisor. And he said, well, I'm a Pauline scholar, and this is something that, we can really chat about, and we can look at how Paul's world was reoriented around his revelation of Christ, and we can investigate Paul's use and his rereading of the Hebrew Bible, having met Jesus. Because I think that's one of the golden questions is like, okay, well, now that we've met Jesus, and now that he's the interpretive principle, the interpretive ethic, the hermeneutic, how do we read the Old Testament? It's like this huge question. And it's like, well, we have like loads of examples. Why don't we look at how it was done by biblical authors?
Yeah.
That's a good place to start. Like, let's see how Jesus did it, or how Paul did it, or how, whoever. Yeah. So Galatians 3 and 4 is a hotbed for debate. Obviously, for Pauline scholars, and he's doing something pretty interesting there. The church at Galatia is trying to be wooed towards getting circumcised and doing works of the law to kind of find their spot in the Abrahamic promise. even though they already received the Spirit and they had already heard Paul's message and they already, met Jesus, so to speak. And so Paul's like, all right, this is ridiculous. You guys are absolutely foolish. Basically, I publicly portrayed Jesus as crucified before you. You met him, and the Spirit's been doing all sorts of works in your midst. And I need to know, how did you get the Spirit? Was it works of law, or was it the proclamation of faithfulness? Or, that's a great term. There's a great debate about how to translate that. It's going to be, I can't wait to write my chapter on that. But what I'm proposing is a particular reading of Galatians 3 and 4. It's called an apocalyptic reading, or the apocalyptic Paul. And it's not, horsemen and end times, left behind kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That is the classic misconception. And I usually don't use the word when I'm talking to the average person, because they immediately lose me. Like, what the heck does that have to do with that? Apocalyptic is based on the Greek word apocalypsis, which just means revelation. Paul uses it at the beginning of Galatians to say, I had an apocalypsis, that God apocalypsed his son to me. And so what I'm going to be doing is looking at Paul's argument in those two chapters, how he uses Abraham, how he talks about, the curse of the law, Abraham's seed being Christ, how he uses pistis, which is usually interpreted faith or faithfulness, and basically showing that we can make most sense of what Paul is saying and what he's doing by seeing him as someone who met Jesus and who had a revelation of Jesus Christ. Yeah. And what Paul is arguing orbits around the revelation of Jesus Christ. It's all pointing back towards that. So there's tons of things Paul is not trying to do in that chapter, in those two chapters, and that's what a lot of commentaries tend to focus on some of these other elements and say, well, really it's all about this or this, but I'll be doing, it's called an apocalyptic reading of Galatians 3 and 4.
Perfect. Wow, it sounds good. I'm very loosely aware of Louis Martin's work on Galatians, which sounds very similarly linked in many ways. And of course, Doug Campbell's In Deliverance of God is his apocalyptic reading of Romans. And it does seem to me that this is, it was actually Michael Harden told me once. He mentioned to me, and this is the reason I tiptoed around Galatians, Louis Martin's book, is because he said he considers it to be the most important work of the 21st century. He says that without a shadow of doubt, in his opinion, it's the most important book written in the last 100 years. And I don't take that, like, he doesn't make extreme statements like that. Generally speaking, he's very careful with, like, this is what I think. And so I took that very seriously. But in my tiptoeing around this topic, the ramifications, we talk about scholarly impact of new ideas, new concepts, new ways of reading things, how that impacts how we approach scripture, and then therefore how that impacts our faith. This is one of those topics that could impact our faith in a night and day way, in my understanding. Would you agree on that kind of thing? This isn't just like, oh, well, when it says Jesus was at a well and he talked to a woman, what age was the woman? And people could spend like 4 years writing a book on like how old the woman was. Really stupid example, but it's not that kind of like study this area. It feels like it's a huge area. Could you like give a real like sweeping, overgeneralized, way too simplistic overview of why that's such a big impact on potentially how we frame a lot of our Christianity? Because I'm probably asking you to like just reveal the end kind of like commentary of your thesis, but spoiler. But I think a lot of people aren't aware of this conversation. They aren't aware that there's these radically different ways of approaching these texts that generally speaking haven't been engaged with for the majority of the time that we've been this faith has been on the planet. It just hasn't been a way that we've approached these texts necessarily. Maybe you could argue early church were, but certainly if they were, that interpretation, that approach has been lost. How do you see kind of some of your interpretations or your theses kind of working out in the church, or the ramifications that they might bring to the church?
Yeah, well, first of all, J. Lou Martin's commentary on Galatians, like, I'm with you, man. I quickly, like, once I got into this conversation, everyone's pointing back to it and saying, like, this is, either the most important work in biblical studies in the last 25 or 50 years. And a lot of people say it's the most important commentary on Galatians in the last century or whatever. And it's like, okay, dang. And even people who disagree with it, they can use the word important.
Still recognize the conversation it's bringing to the table.
Because it's changed the conversation on the book, and it's opened people's eyes to a completely different way of approaching it. So, I'd recommend people getting into that if they're doing any sort of...
Not massively accessible though, right?
Yeah, fair enough. It is an academic commentary.
So people need to know what they're getting into. Like, this is... I literally just looked at my shoulder. I've got it right here. It's like... It's
red, yeah.
Chunky book and like small text and like mostly footnotes. It's like...
Yeah.
It's not, and not only that, it's also got the wonderful price tag of an academic book. I think it was like £52 or something, or it's like that's $80, $70. So welcome to academia. But yeah, very, very highly recommended if you're gonna want to tiptoe into this world. Great place to start, probably.
Yeah, if you've got a resource like a church who's going to pay for your study or whatever, or a local academic library, they will have it if it's an academic library. It's great. And you can do that, but you're right, it's expensive, and it is more dense. So it's just if you want to deep dive into Galatians, that is a place you can't not engage with that voice if you're going to really do Galatians. Like, if you're going to really do it, you have to have that voice at least in the mix, whether you agree with it or not. Yeah. You got me so excited. I'm like completely forgetting your actual question. Oh, yeah. What's the impact of what I would be studying? So for Paul, the idea is that nothing in Paul's world is framing or interpreting Christ. So his history is not making sense of, and to use a couple academic words, contextualizing or conditioning what's received to him from Christ. Like, he's not going, oh yeah. I know Christ because what I learned from Judaism or this or that, which I know is controversial, which I can explain a bit, but Christ comes, and this is the definitive revelation of God. And this is now at the center of what Paul knows. It's definitely an epistemological impact in his world. And now everything in his world now orbits around this revelation of Christ and makes sense in light of Christ. So everything Jewish in his world it wasn't dropped, it wasn't put aside. You can even leave the word conversion aside if you don't like that. But it definitely now makes sense having seen Christ. Like, it definitely needs to go in that order for Paul. Everything now passes through that, which is why he can say neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female. It's not that these things, these identifiers are negative or need to be dropped, but they're put in their proper place as after being in Christ as the top supreme location for us. Sure, you can be a Jew or Gentile, but these things aren't our dominant our dominant identity. Sure. And so I think when you look at what Paul's doing with scripture, how he quotes Abraham, it's amazing. He says, well, he doesn't quote Abraham, but he quotes Genesis, and he says, okay, when it says that it was to Abraham's sperma, which is the Greek word for like his descendants, or his sons or whatever, he says, oh, it's not plural, it's not seeds, it's seed. But you go back, and it's absolutely a collective plural. Like that's in Genesis, plural. And so Paul is not misremembering, and Paul is not changing things or trying to kind of skirt around it to make a point. And he's not hoping people won't check the text after this. He's showing you how these things now bend and they pass through Christ. Like he's showing us the dominance of the revelation of Christ and how Scripture now must come through Christ. He can look back and say, well, this is the true seed. And we see the impact of the revelation of Christ on Paul. And he starts just doing crazy things and saying, he talks about Scripture, and it's the Greek word graphe, and how it was foreseeing and prophesying to Abraham about what Christ would do in the future with the Gentiles. So he's saying graphe, which is the Greek word for like written text. So it is actual writing. So he is talking about actual written Scripture. He's saying that prophesied to Abraham, which is before its existence. It hasn't been written. Like there's no law, there's nothing, there's no Israel yet.
Yeah.
Somehow this is like transcending time and doing Christ's bidding by like preaching the gospel ahead of time, seeing. So all these different elements are animated in this unique way of him saying, like, if we have seen Christ, like I've seen Christ, Christ was publicly portrayed to you. You have the Spirit of Christ doing stuff in your midst. You're in Christ. You've been clothed in Christ and baptized. All this language is in chapters 3 and 4. And so I think how it lands for us is like, well, we need to be rereading our Old Testaments in light of having seen Jesus, and it must pass through that. And if someone is trying to use Abraham to get us to, whatever the modern day equivalent would be, circumcision, they're like trying to do something that's going to walk us away from our position of just knowing we're in Christ, then Paul goes, okay, well, let's just talk Abraham. And then he just runs it all through Christ and makes it about Christ. I think we need to read Scripture with that hermeneutic, that lens, and that's going to play out big time for us. And then I think just for me, it's been a challenge of seeing how Paul's whole world and his whole outlook has been dramatically impacted by Christ. And like, I find myself sometimes asking myself, like, all right, is my whole world impacted in the way I'm proposing Paul's was, and in the way I'm arguing is evident in what he writes? Like, is it, is Christ at the epistemological center for me as well? Does what I know now begin in that revelation and work outwards from there, or is Christ at moments kind of an addendum to my current life? So sure. I think seeing how it's all consuming for Paul and how it fits in his world, I think is just a challenge for us. It's going, wow, this is a big deal for him, and this turned his world upside down. I think if it hasn't had that impact on my life, I should probably check what's going on.
Yeah, it feels like, this is a huge one. I think I don't know if you've read Derek Flood's Disarming Scripture. It's a fantastic book, but he captured this really well, where he kind of went through so much of the New Testament writers and just said, let's look at how they quote the Old Testament. Well, let's just look at when they quote the Old Testament. But look here, they quoted this psalm, and it's like, it starts like with one passage a bit, and then afterwards it says like, it was like God will select these people to completely destroy them for his pleasure. And then he's like, and then look at Paul. He just said God will select these people for his pleasure. He just took out the bit where God destroys them. And it's like, that's how Paul read that passage in the Psalms. Like, what the hell? And he just does this with passage after passage. And you're like, yeah, what the hell? Like you start to realize, like, because we're programmed as good kind of Protestant Christians that, well, the Bible's this kind of flat playing field, and every passage, you just pick that passage out, it's the word of God, and you pick from there, that's the word of God, and you pick from here, that's the word of God, and it's all the word of God, and we have to appreciate and value every single word evenly and appropriately, and it's very devoid of a context that is through the lens of Jesus, that has a hermeneutic that says, okay, yes, but knowing what we know about God through Jesus, if Jesus reveals God, can we see God in that moment? Because generally speaking, a lot of time you're like, Paul's like, no, not in that bit of the sentence, so I'll just take it out. And I'm like, whoa, what's happening here? It's a really good book at exploring that kind of concept. But to me, obviously that's a great example. Violence and wrath is quite an obvious thing that's hard. It's possible for people to kind of angle Jesus a little bit to include some of that, but on the whole, he was very anti violence and wrathful action, and certainly along the human side of things. And so just that alone has huge ramifications, in my opinion, for Christianity. But then you go, okay, what else did Jesus say that felt somewhat different to the general narrative of the Old Testament? Holy crap, there's a lot of topics here. And so it feels like it's not a small bit of scripture that is like, it's not just that you're looking at Galatians 3 and 4 and going, oh, I'm looking at Galatians 3 and 4, and what can we learn from Galatians 3 and 4 that will change our lives? You're kind of almost going, oh, I'm looking at Galatians 3 and 4, and guess what? The entire Bible needs to be reread. You're wrong. Like, it's a big conclusion that kind of shifts it. No, it's really interesting. Do you know of anyone that's written at quite an accessible level about this topic? You've got like things like Deliverance from God and J. Lou Martin's. I think actually I do agree that it's not too bad actually, but it's a lot. Do you know of anyone that's doing work in this area? I know that Doug Campbell's working on something, but like you said,
good question.
You don't have to have an answer if you don't know. It's okay.
Well, Torrance.
Okay.
He's behind. So he's a theologian and less of a biblical scholar, and his theology is incredibly apocalyptic, and Campbell admits often, like, Torrance got me into this, and it's Torrance's dad's or his uncle's articles that suddenly exposed me to a contractual versus participatory gospel, and it just snowballed for Campbell into the deliverance of God. It's kind of the snowball led there. Torrance, and then so again, this is one of those problems of reading narrowly within your topic, that I'm not reading a ton of approachable stuff around different areas, but I know Beverly Gaventa, she wrote a book called When in Romans, and it's a more approachable look at Romans, and she's an apocalyptic Pauline scholar, and that one is, I think it's really readable. I actually have a copy.
Is this the person you recommended I should get on the podcast? You mentioned someone I should.
I did. Yeah. I recommended her. Yep. She was one of them.
I need to try and get hold of her.
Yeah. She's amazing.
Cool.
And I'll have to be thinking, but I think there needs to be more.
Yeah.
Cause you've got Lou Martin, who, he came and went, and he didn't write anything popular level that I know of, other than maybe a couple articles. And then there's Martinus de Boer, who he's still around, but it's still, I think, pretty much just all academic stuff. And then there's Gaventa, Campbell, and my supervisor, Chris Tilling. But again, it's all ultra academic stuff.
Yeah. And this is the thing, it feels like it's still very new. This whole kind of topic on the whole is quite new, and it will be very academic on the whole initially. So I think that's not to say anything negative of people that are doing the hard academic work. They don't have time to be going, oh, let me like also write an entire book on the side that's more accessible. Like they're doing some incredible work as well. And so, but yeah, no, it's cool that there are people doing that. But,
and I should mention, just to cover my bases, that I'm only listing English speaking scholars, but the apocalyptic reading did not start in the UK or the States. It's Germany, really, with like Ernst Käsemann, Rudolf Boltzmann, and a couple of these great figures, and then it slowly made its way over to English speakers. But I think it's newish within the past 120 years, which is very new in terms of church history. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Wow, dude, this has been really good. I'm just fascinated by this whole world. I'm fascinated by the world of academia, of studying, of going deep, way more than most of us ever get to go. And I love that that's something that you're doing. I love that I get to chat to you and like feed on that and pull it all out. And so we'll have to get you on again to talk about more beautiful Pauline stuff, especially as you keep going deeper. You'll have more and more, I'm sure.
That's the hope. That's the idea. So I better next time we talk.
Yeah, I mean, no pressure. Talk about external pressure again, right?
Exactly.
We'll get a date in the diary for the next podcast. And you're like, crap, I need to come up with something profound now, and some sort of new concept.
Exactly.
So if people want to track with you and follow what you're doing, you're one of the new generation academics. You're going to be super cool. You're going to be like on Instagram and, have all these like great ways for people to engage with theology. How can I do that? Again, pressure.
Theology on TikTok. Yeah.
Dude,
no,
has to happen.
I know. I'm not there yet. So I created one account that I made it because my supervisor, my PhD supervisor recommended like, hey, you need to find some sort of outlet to have to communicate what you're learning. Otherwise you'll be in this little, insular echo chamber where you're thinking it makes sense in your head and you're not really talking to anyone about it. And you're going to like learn way more if you have to articulate it and then have people question you and say, I don't understand that. And you're like, you don't, and then you have to really work it out. So he recommended a blog and I'm like, nope, that's so much work. I don't want to do that, but I do know the world of Instagram decently well. So I made an Instagram account that I just try and post bits of what I'm learning, and I try and teach people academic words on occasion and different ways to approach topics and stuff. You'll have to spell it in the notes or something, but
I'm gonna have to spell it, right? Because this is a recurring joke, right? And you know what? It's so funny because I mean, how many years have I known you? And I know that your name is pronounced Nash, but it's spelled Neusch. But it's funny because when you started this Instagram account, I literally read it Neuschanality, and it's only like literally it was like a month or two later that I was suddenly like, wait, that's not his name, no, it's Nash. And I was like, Nash, and I was like, that's crazy. Like I had this like aha moment that was like a month and a half late. So yeah, absolutely.
I know.
So I'll make sure that's in the show notes, but go spell it out just for people right now.
It's called it's called Nationalism, which is also a nod to kind of some of my evolution on loyalty to Christ versus nation as well. So it's a kind of a deep level joke there for my friends who know me. So nationalism, and honestly, that's it. So you can wait, and in like 2023, you can read my dissertation if it gets passed.
There you go. And your TikTok would be live by then as well, probably.
Absolutely. I'll be viral.
Once everyone moves off of Instagram onto TikTok.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I love it. Dude, it was great having you on, man. I really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed
Great
it.
chatting with you, man.
So,
we didn't get into all of our stories and our past.
Antics.
Dude, we have such a history.
Oh.
That's definitely gonna have to be part 2.
There should be a whole separate podcast where they're telling ridiculous stories.
Man,
I can't even begin to think of half of them. Yeah.
I know. There's just too much.
So many hours in coffee shops. Like
so many.
So you won a year's free coffee, right? At one of the coffee
Absolutely.
shops. We were in there so long.
I bought a $1 raffle ticket and I won free coffee for a year. You could go in every day and get the biggest coffee you wanted for free.
So
I took them up on that.
Yeah, and I followed you. I sat at the next.
You were there most of the time with me. Yeah,
that was good. It's good times.
Crazy.
Yeah. Oh man, very good times.
Man, well, thanks for having me on. It's been awesome. I'm loving your wallpaper.
It's gonna go soon. You know, once the pandemic kind of eases and we maybe get access to things like paint, it'll probably go. I think I'm gonna decorate in here at some point. The bigger issue is the floor. There's a hole in the floor. The floorboard's like broken, and that's been for about 9 months, basically, pretty much since we moved in. So probably actually closer to a year. And so one day I just kind of went through the floorboard and I was like, oh, there you go. And it's right there where one of my legs of my chair goes.
Gosh.
It's a bit sketchy. So I'm less worried about wallpaper and more worried about falling through into the kitchen.
It's a big deal.
A possibility, which would make for an amazing visual podcast moment. If like, what would you have done if just straight down to the floor? Like,
it'd be amazing.
So who knows? Maybe I'll not fix the floor just so that happens at some point.
Please do it.
Cool. Well, give my love to Kezia and the rest of the family.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can't believe you guys are all crammed in. Oh man, I would go insane. I'm already insane, and I'm like living with one person right now.
We're a full house.
It's crazy. Yeah. The thing of like, it's got to be an introvert psychological thing because this was my life beforehand. Nothing's really changed. I was constantly in the same house. My wife was working from home. But suddenly there's a thing of like, you're not allowed out. And suddenly I'm like, I feel very claustrophobic, stuck in a house with my wife all the time. I need some escape. I went for like a 2-hour walk yesterday. I walked like 11K or something.
That's amazing.
Good walk. Got some blisters for that. But yeah. But dude, we should have another chat at some point.
Sounds great.
Once all the Zooms wear off and life's a bit more normal. But yeah, and if you and Kezia ever want to come up to Manchester to hang out, you're welcome to.
We got to do it.
Yeah, we're only 2 hours away. So.
Oh, you're right.
Well, not really though, because you've got to get to London and then got to get to me from Manchester. But that bit is 2 hours.
It's true. I mean, everything in England is close compared to US proportions.
Yeah.
So
we've done much worse. Did we drive to Texas at one point?
Yeah.
Dude, do you remember that?
Yes, that's another story.
The truck exploded while we were driving. Dude.
On the middle of the road, out of nowhere.
And then we didn't go to Texas.
No, my dad met us halfway.
I don't remember going to Texas, but I remember going to Texas. Yeah, we stopped in like Arizona or something. Yeah.
Yep.
Dude, good times. Yeah. We should definitely have a chat where we like reminisce on these crazy stories.
I know.
I love it. Well, love you, man. It was good to chat.
Love you too. Thanks for having me.